mentioning, I appreciate your mentioning mention service next Saturday. If you go onto the Covenant website, I put a link in the preview that went out, and kind of scroll down to the bottom of that welcoming page at Covenant, you'll see a great big picture of Vince in his study. And he used to sit right up here on the front row, and he came here into his late 90s, and he holds the record for having the most letters published in the Houston Chronicle. And he was out to the left a little bit. He's a great guy. He's a great guy. And speaking of great guys, there is a man in the crowd today with his wife who can outread circles around everybody in this room. And that man, when he worked here, was and still is worth his weight in gold. Billy Burke, sitting back here. I am so glad that you all are here. It's good to see you. Now, you know that next Sunday there will not be a service here. This will not be here. But, oh, Lord. Let's start over. All right. Next Sunday's services are at 8, 9:30, and 11. And there will also be services every day this week. You can go on the St. Paul's website and see what those are. There will be a Monday, Thursday noon service, a Monday, Thursday service at 7 p.m., which is a very dramatic stripping of the altar service. There will be another service at noon on Friday. I think there is a bilingual Good Friday service in the afternoon. And I'm doing the homily at the Good Friday noon service, the happiest day in the Christian calendar. And I would appreciate it if you come. A lot of people are not aware of this, but clergy salaries are based on the percentage of people who actually come to the service. But really, it's a wonderful week. And if you like religious theater, and I'm not in any way disparaging it, the Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, and certainly Easter services are probably the finest religious theater in the city of Houston. It's really great. The music is great. The music is great today if you want to go to 11 o'clock service, and we'll be done in time with that for you. I think that's it. So remember, no matter who you are, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. Okay, as promised, it's time for our test. What are the blank looks I'm getting back? Did you do it? Did you do your homework? How many of you did your homework? Oh my God, look at that. I am impressed. How many of you don't have a clue what I'm talking about? You know, in the West, we do not have a tradition of honoring teachers like they do in the East. In the Eastern religions, in Hinduism, Buddhism, Zen, Taoism, there is a tradition of honoring teachers. And I employed a teacher. I frequently refer to him as my first spiritual teacher when I came to Houston. And the reason that I got with this guy was that he was just so irrepressibly happy. And I wanted some of that for me. And so I went to see him. And he is the man who stressed for me in the very beginning the importance of having a practice. And he said over and over to me that what was important about spiritual practice was persistence and patience. Persistence and patience in the practice. And the way that he said that was something like this. At least I've modified it over the years to be this. He said, let's suppose that you decide that you want to know how to play the piano. And so, you know you can't learn that by yourself, so you hire a piano teacher to teach you to play the piano. And even if you engage the best piano teacher in the world, just going to the lessons would not be enough. You have to practice. Well, that made sense to me about having a daily practice. And then he added a kicker by saying, if you do decide to practice because you truly want to know how to play the piano, perhaps in 6 weeks or so, you will know how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And that was a kind of sober realism. Because in the West, we are educated to get results like that, and if we don't get them, we quit. We think this isn't working. It takes years to do what we're talking about. So, the assignment that I gave you last week was that you memorize the first stanza. And it depends on how you, if you go back and you look at the way this prayer has developed since the beginning of the 19th century, it's either in 2 stanzas or 3 stanzas. Sometimes the second stanza is broken into 2 parts. But the first stanza is, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, let me sow pardon. Where there is doubt, let me sow faith. Where there is despair, let me sow hope. Where there is darkness, let me sow light. Where there is sadness, let me sow joy. Now you can learn it. If I can learn it at my age, you can learn it. Now, I want you to see if you can figure out why a prayer like this would appeal to me so much. It embodies a principle that is very, very, very important to my teaching. And that is that it is non-sectarian. You could be an adherent of any religion and embrace this prayer. Because the values that are held up in this prayer of peace, love, pardon, faith, hope, light, and joy are values that you can embrace regardless of what your religious practices are. I do believe that having religious paths is important, and sometimes we'll talk more explicitly about this, but you know, because you read the paper, that religions can be dangerous. Religions can cause a lot of trouble in the world. And we got enough that divides us already. But peace, love, pardon, faith, hope, light, and joy are not divisive matters. My teacher also said to me, you can't hit a target you can't see. So when I would get with him, and this is another line I've stolen in my own counseling and direction work, to begin a session with his saying to me, what would make this time worthwhile for you today? What would you like to get out of this today? And I'm just suggesting that you have a way to hold these values in front of you on a regular basis so that you can see them, so that you will have a way of kind of evaluating how these values show up in your daily life in the specific relationships you have with yourself and with your intimate friends, people in your family, and people all around you. So I think it's very appropriate to begin with this St. Francis prayer today because we're going to wade out into what can be, for some people, the most turbulent religious water there is. We're going to begin today, and we'll pick this up again after Easter, looking at how to think about and relate to the Bible in this territory I'm calling the gap between the no longer and the not yet. There is likely nothing that divides people anymore who call themselves either Jews or Christians than how they think about the Bible, how they relate to the Bible. A few weeks ago, on February the 8th to be exact, there was an article in the New York Times about a software program that's used by professors to help them catch students who plagiarize on term papers. This software has now been used by some literary scholars to find an unpublished manuscript that has helped them believe that they have found the inspiration for Shakespeare's King Lear, Macbeth, Richard III, Henry V, and 7 other plays written by Shakespeare. And the scholars who have done this work say that this is a monumental discovery. It does not suggest that Shakespeare plagiarized this material, but rather that he was strongly influenced by it. This article was on the front page of the New York Times, and then in the inside of the paper, on like page 16, where they put these things, full page article in the Times on this article. And you can read about it by going to the Times archive, or you can, if you want to spend $120, buy this book, which is about that research. I guess there's not a big market for it. There were several things that struck me about this. One was the immense space that this discovery got in the New York Times. I mean, it wasn't just a little article. It was an article on the front page and a full page inside. That was one thing. The second thing was the relief that I felt to realize that they didn't have this program when I was in graduate school. Most preachers would not like it applied to their sermons. And another thing is that this subject is so exciting for people who are into this sort of thing. Not only do people greet it with excitement, but also with enthusiasm, which is not to say that was the same for Shakespeare's wife, who said, "Oh, wow, another sonnet." Now, you might think, if you listen to the rhetoric that's coming out of various expressions of the Christian church, that the hottest item out there today is the LGBT controversy. This doesn't even begin to address the matter of the role of women in Catholic churches, both Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches, as well as some expressions of the Protestant church, the church that birthed me, Southern Baptist. There's no place for women in that church. In a few weeks, the United Methodist Church is going to receive a report from the Council of Bishops. And it will give a report on what they call the way forward for how the United Methodists can address the issue of inclusive language to some degree in the Book of Discipline. And this has been a study that's been going on for a couple of years. I don't know what's in the report, but I do know, because I have talked to some people who are kind of high in the organization, that they're trying to work out a way that will create a big enough umbrella that will include those who want to go for full inclusion language. Now, we'll talk about that at some point. All the way to those who want to keep things as they have been. And create an umbrella big enough to embrace all of that. And my fear about that is that when that report is made public, because they want to make room for people who want to keep it as it is, that the report is generally going to be seen as anti-gay. That will be the press response to this. So I said to the person who was talking to me about this, I said, don't the people who are working on this realize that in putting it that way, they are shooting themselves in the foot as far as appealing to younger people and people who are more inclusive in the outer world? And the response I got was, they don't see it that way. They see it as maintaining doctrinal purity. Now, doctrinal purity or doctrinal purity is a code phrase for how we interpret the Bible. the subject matter of this code phrase has changed in America over the decades. It started out with being slavery, and then it started out with being the issue of integration, racial integration. Then it started out with being the place that divorced people could have in serving in the church. And then it started out with including the issue of women. And now it's gotten to the issue of the LGBT community. And but the big issue is, how do we see the Bible? How do we interpret the Bible? Now, it may or may not surprise you to know that there are people who have never actually read the Bible, who have never read a contemporary piece of scholarship about the Bible. Say, read something like Marcus Borg's Reading the Bible Again for the first time, who nonetheless get very upset when anything that even sounds remotely critical of the Bible is brought up. Their reaction can be anything from a mild, unarticulated discomfort to explicit anger. And now, I want to say, although I doubt this is true, some of you may find yourself having some similar reactions to what I'm going to say today and in the weeks ahead. And if so, we can work it out. You know, because you have been listening to me, I assume, that I don't believe in the fundamentalist claim that the Bible is the inerrant word from God. And we're talking now about this gap that we live in, and the first principle of fundamentalism is a belief in an inerrant word of God. The God I know does not dictate books. I don't believe this collection of mostly Jewish writings is universally applicable or authoritative. Sometimes I will hear people say things like, well, yeah, I know it's not literally true. I know it's not all literal, but it's all true. And my response is, no, it's not. There are parts of the Bible that are false. They're not true in any shape or form. There are parts of the Bible which, if taken seriously, are harmful. However, the way I see it, the Bible does not have to be all true or good to have value. One of the tasks of Jewish Christian scholarship is opening the door for a better, wiser, more useful way to see, read, and appropriate the Bible. Okay? Now, there's a saying that goes, if you want to convince somebody to become an atheist, just ask them to read the Bible. Because the God that atheists do not believe in is a literal form of the God that is presented in the Bible. It's not a universal, mystical form of energy that I would refer to when I use the phrase sacred mystery. The reason I'm reluctant even to use the word God, because it's so easily misunderstood. Now, one of the ways to understand fundamentalism in any religion, and this is certainly true of Christian fundamentalism, is that a literal approach to the Bible stunts people from any continued religious or spiritual growth. Biblical literalists and Christian fundamentalists love to quote the I am sayings from the Gospel of John. I am the door. I am the way. I am the life. Earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, and I'll just give you a hint that we're going to begin with some other of these kinds of contradictions in 2 weeks. There's a talk that I've given the title, Some Assembly Required. Does not come with batteries. Earlier in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. And then about 30 years later, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is quoted as saying, I am the light of the world. Which is it? Cherry picking one as being literally true, and no biblical scholar sees John that way, is where much of Christianity and consequently the church has gone astray. And the one thing I would like for you to get from this time together today, though I hope you get more, is that you are the light of the world and that Jesus shows us the way for this to be true for us. Now, the division among people who have opinions about this Bible is a division over whether this book is divinely inspired or whether it is a humanly constructed book. Those are the two major choices. And I come down, and I suppose you'll have to decide this for yourself. It's a huge decision. On the side that says that the Bible was written by humans, just like you and me, who were inspired to make sense of the world in which they lived at the time. And there is a progression of morality in the Bible that is shaped very much by the culture in which the people who wrote it lived. Now, some of the stories in the Bible are simply borrowed from earlier cultures. They were available to the storytellers of the Bible, like the flood story. There are many flood stories in the ancient world. And the story that we have presented in the Bible was simply given a spin that fit the tribe that wrote that story that got it included in Jewish literature. Now, we've done that. I mean, we have borrowed from other cultures, some we even label pagan cultures, a lot of our Christmas traditions, and baptized them to say, this is what we want to bring into our lives. So the Bible, the God in the Bible is not literally God. There is no literal God in the sense that the Bible talks about. And the realization of this, I think, is part of what's created this gap that we're in right now between the no longer and the not yet. We simply cannot point to a bigger-than-life, human-like figure in the sky. When the tribe of people referred to as the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob envisioned an ideal monotheistic God, they did so at a time that every tribe had its God. At the time of the creation stories that you read in Genesis, there were other creation stories that featured another God whose name was Marduk. God was the primary God over the Mesopotamian people. Indeed, if you read the Bible carefully, you will see that at the beginning of the story, there's not just one God, but that Yahweh is presented as the most powerful among competing gods. And even the opening of one of the creation stories in the book of Genesis, there are two, God says, let us make man in our own image. Now, fundamentalist Christians say that God was talking to Jesus and the Holy Spirit. When God uses the word us, God is talking among the council of gods. And in the writings we call the Bible, there are many mischaracterizations of God, and there are many unsustainable moral positions. Again, people today cherry pick which one of those moralities they want to embrace, depending on what culture they are part of. Though there is wisdom in the Bible, even among the most open-minded religious person today, there is a tendency to read the Bible and key in on what we already believe. This is called confirmation bias. We see what we want to see. We embrace what we want to embrace. Although there is no doubt among the biblical scholars who have given their lives to study this, that Jesus said, if you want to follow me, you have to sell everything that you have, give it to the poor, and come on. Nobody does that. Even those who take the Bible literally. When reading the Bible, you should be acutely aware of what type of literature or writing is being read. Even more importantly, be aware of the context in which it is written, the audience to which it is being written. Sometimes what we read in the Bible can have relevance for us, sometimes it doesn't. There's some extremely positive, useful material in the Bible. There is some extremely negative and unuseful material in the Bible. Both Jesus and his teachings have been hijacked and consequently made dysfunctional by Christian fundamentalism. Now, I personally think it's fun, interesting, valuable to sort this stuff out. So what's useful, what's not useful, what did Jesus say, what did he not say, play with these kind of things. Now, I think most people out there, maybe some of you, came, and the reason for this is because evangelical Christianity in America has been so evangelistic about their beliefs, and they've had such big megaphones, that what people were told about the Bible and what it meant to be Christian is simply the truth of the matter. And here's what that is in summary. That the God of the Bible was that the Bible is the literal, authentic Word of God. Jesus was God's Son who died for your sins. He rose from the dead. In his lifetime, he could do amazing things, like turn water into wine and walk on water. His body came out of a closed tomb, his physical body, 3 days after he was executed. After visiting with his disciples, he was wafted physically up into the sky and consequently heaven. And that someday he is going to come back to separate the sheep from the goats. You have to decide which one you want to join. And that though it saddens him in some ways, God would have no problem sending people to hell to burn eternally who did not measure up to this God's requirements for going to heaven. Now, the requirements for going to heaven vary from group to group. You either believed all of this stuff, perhaps crossing your fingers about it, winking knowingly like we do at children about Santa Claus. Not really true, but... Or you simply rejected the whole thing. Those have been the choices for a lot of people. I either have to accept this, which I really don't believe, but I need to call myself Christian, so I will go to heaven when I die, or to hell with the whole thing, and me too, I guess. Now, the Bible is an extremely important document, and understanding it is important, so that either of these positions that I'm holding up are not useful. They are not wise. So when you are reading the Bible, you are reading someone's perspective that reflects the time and place in which they lived. It is not God's perspective. It's some person's perspective. Even when that person says it is the Word of God, what they are saying is that this is their perspective on God's perspective. Get it? Because nobody knows the mind of God. It's unknowable. And I think it's important not to confuse the two. So, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to hit some turbulent water. This talk today may be a smidgen more academic than you're used to or like, but it's so important. It is so important that we know this material, this information. We're at a turning point in human history. Read the paper. What we believe, what we practice in this gap matters. What you believe, what you practice in this gap matters. There are people and families and groups who hold it that the Bible is a divinely inspired collection of sacred writing, and many who don't. Does that make a difference? Of course it does. Families are torn asunder by theological differences. You know what it's like to go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and the things you can't talk about. We call them political, but they're values. How about the matter of evolution? Does it matter what people believe here? Of course it does. Look at the debate occurring in the arena of public education and people at the highest levels fighting to teach creationism. Is it the case that devout Jews and faithful Christians will burn forever in hell because they don't believe that the words of the prophet expressed in the Quran are the words of God? Hundreds of millions of people believe that. Just as many don't. And the result on a personal level is that perfectly good people come to harbor judgment and resentment against other perfectly good people. And on a collective basis, we go to war with each other. It matters what we believe. What we know, what we believe about our sacred writings matters. So I want to take the time today and in the next 2 weeks to contribute to religious literacy by offering data that should have been part of the church's education program a long time ago, but you won't hear stuff like this in most churches. For reasons I won't go into today, I got interested in both religion and psychology at a very early age, and I wanted to put the two together. And the position I've come to now is you can't separate them. They're together inherently. So I, as part of this, in studying religion, started studying Greek when I was an undergraduate. And we began, when I got to graduate school, studying the Gospel of Mark and then Galatians. Those are two of the easier books in the New Testament canon to translate. And by the time, I'm not bragging, I'm just telling you the facts. By the time I sat for my doctoral oral exam, I had to be prepared for one of the professors to push a Greek New Testament across the table to me and say, open it and read it at any page, any passage. And I could do that. Now, because that is not proven to be a useful skill in my daily life, I have lost my ability to do that. According to the scholars, there have been 3 periods in the study of Christianity when there have been what these scholars refer to as the quest for the historical Jesus. The first one began in the middle of the 19th century with a man named David Strauss. I'm going to come back to him in a minute. The way for Strauss to do his work was paved in the first part of the 16th century by a man whose name was Erasmus. Now, Erasmus decided that there needed to be an accurate Greek New Testament for scholars to read. And so this guy went around and collected all of the manuscripts and all of the variant readings that he could, and he published a Greek New Testament. And what he did in his work was he discovered that some of the monks who, when transcribing, they didn't have printed press, they didn't have computers, transcribing the Greek New Testament, they made mistakes. They left words out. They inserted their own opinions. Right? Now, you may not be aware of this. You can go Google this. You can find this. I'm not making this stuff up. There was an edition of when we got a printing press, there was an edition of the Bible that was printed where they left the word not out of the 7th commandment. What's the 7th commandment? We don't know. Go look it up. So the people who did the New Testament were amending things. They were changing things. They shaped some things according to their theology. They took some other things out. By the time I began to own my first Greek New Testament, it looked pretty much like this. Now, I've shown you this before, but I just want you to get an idea. This is Greek for, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Son of God is put in parentheses over here, according to, and it goes on and on. This is where the Gospel of Mark stops, right here. All the rest down the page, these are variant readings that you will find in other manuscripts. Now, the people who say that God dictated the Bible, God changed her mind a lot while working on this document. Now, we studied this. It was serious work. It ain't easy to be able to translate the Greek New Testament, but at the time, nobody made a big deal out of the fact that Jesus didn't speak Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic. We have 2 phrases in the New Testament in Aramaic from Jesus, just 2. One is the word Abba for Father, and the other is, my God, why have you forsaken me, from the cross. I have friends whose native tongue is not English, and we'll be in a conversation, and they will want to tell me something important, and they will pause and say, that doesn't translate into English. Oh, okay. There's no way to put that into English. Now, I'm sure you have likely all heard of Joseph in the Hebrew Scripture. He was the favorite son of Jacob. The 12 tribes started with this family. He was treated as a favorite son. He was an arrogant young man, so much so did he get on his brother's nerves that they plotted to kill him. But at the last minute changed their mind, and they sold him into slavery, and he got sent to Egypt. It's a great story. It's a great story. And you likely know that Joseph was such a favorite of his father's that his father had him a coat made of many colors. That ain't in the Bible. No. What the Hebrew says was, Jacob made for Joseph a coat with long sleeves. But when they translated the Bible into English in England, King James Version, everybody had long sleeves. So it didn't set Joseph apart. So the people who translated the Bible made up this notion that Joseph had a coat of many colors. Sorry. At one time, I counted, I had 30 different translations of the New Testament. 30. Different. Okay. So, as time passed among these scholars, a question made its way into the academic circles. And the question was, what did Jesus really say? Now, those of you who grew up in the church, you probably were given or had a Bible referred to as a red letter edition of the New Testament, in which everything Jesus said is in red letters. I think some of what he did was pretty important too, but that's not in red letters. Some of the statements, however, that are in red letters actually contradict other statements that are in red letters. Maybe Jesus didn't remember what he said from one day to another, but anyway, the scholars begin to wonder, what did Jesus really say? So, during the last 2 centuries, there's been a revolution in biblical scholars. Today, those who are the most respected New Testament biblical scholars know, I mean, this is just common knowledge, that the New Testament writers were not eyewitnesses to what Jesus said and did. They wrote the gospel stories anywhere from 40 to 70 years after his death. And during that time, the mindset of the storytellers, there were no tape recorders, there were no legal pads, were greatly influenced by what the scholars call the oral tradition, meaning that these stories were in a fluid state. They changed from group to group and from person to person to fit the doctrinal goals of the person telling the story. Perhaps one of the greatest breakthroughs in New Testament scholarship was the realization that the gospel narratives were shaped by the liturgy of Jewish worship. This may be new information to you, but the disciples of Jesus were Jews. And when Jesus was executed, whatever happened that we call resurrection, for decades, they went back into the synagogue as good Jews to worship. And in the form of the Jews are liturgical geniuses. And in the liturgies of the Jewish year, which was finally prescribed and shaped, these followers of Jesus began to tell stories of Jesus that fit the Jewish liturgical year. Pentecost, for example, is a Jewish festival. We Christians just appropriate it. So, and in addition to this, we only have really 3 historical Gospels of Jesus in the Christian canon. There were many others. Some we still have, some got destroyed. But in 1835, this guy, a man named David Strauss, wrote a book called The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. Now, some people are so hypersensitive about both Jesus and the Bible that just the very word criticism upsets them when applied to Jesus or the Bible. Now, we don't have a problem when we think of a music critic or an art critic or a food critic or some other kind of critic, but it's not to criticize the Bible. The biblical criticism is just about determining what kind of literature this is, what's the context of the literature, what is the form of the literature that is written. At any rate, Strauss, basing his work on Erasmus, is one of the first who pointed out the fluid nature of the oral tradition and how the early Christians both remodeled and invented stories they told about Jesus. So by the time I got to seminary, what we were taught is Jesus taught in parables. And Jesus' followers taught parables about Jesus. That was very freeing to realize that what we were reading was parabolic in its nature. This work by Strauss is like a bombshell in the academic community. There is in every academic's mind today a vast difference between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. Two different entities there. Indeed, that phrase belongs to Strauss, although it's been copied by others. So from Erasmus through Strauss, that was one period in biblical studies that came to be called the first quest for the historical Jesus. Now, this talk today is not about Jesus or about quest for historical Jesus. We will get to that. But I did want you to know about it. I want you to know that there have been 3 quests for the historical Jesus. The second quest for the historical Jesus was ushered in by this man, Albert Schweitzer, who was a polymath, if ever there was one, doctor, musician, missionary, scholar, mystic, all of that. He wrote a book on the quest for the historical Jesus. And the man that I mentioned to you last week, Rudolf Bultmann, was also part of this. And these were the scholars that we studied when I was in graduate school and when I was in seminary. The second quest for the historical Jesus was in full bloom. And the second quest for the historical Jesus said, we can't really know the historical Jesus. What we can know is the preaching that the early church did about Jesus. And we talked about that last week. We have the Christ of faith. Some time passed. Then we've had the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Third quest for the historical Jesus begins with people like John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg and Robert Funk and other people who are part of the Jesus Seminar. And I don't expect you to read all these books that I'm putting out today. You read them only if you want to go to heaven. So, I want you to know that they're there. I want you to know that this is out there and that these are very readable books. Bart Ehrman is not part of the Jesus Seminar, but these 2 books I would highly recommend. Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why, and Jesus Interrupted. And it says at the bottom of that, for more than a few folks, Jesus Interrupted will be a grenade tossed into their tidy living rooms of religious faith. I want you to know about these books. I would like for you to just wonder, why aren't these staple offerings in the education program of every Protestant church or every Christian church? You know, archaeologists today have better tools. Linguists have better tools. So they're doing better works, just as with the Shakespeare thing that I began. And they're bringing that study to the Bible. John Dominic Crossan, in his work, he is such a guy. He says, my point once again is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we're now dumb enough to take them literally. So, when these scholars do their work and they come at somebody who is a biblical literalist and they say there are things in the New Testament Jesus didn't say, that's upsetting. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. In John, Jesus is quoted as saying, I am the light of the world. Which is it? I'm assuming Matthew and John attended the same talk. So, some assembly required next time we get together. Right? So when we meet next time, we're going to begin here with the work that is required, the mindset that it takes to read the Bible. It's our book, it's our document, it's our family album. It's okay to look at it and say, you know, Aunt Mabel did not take a good picture. Almost no biblical scholar takes anything that Jesus said in the Gospel of John as literally what Jesus said. Jesus wasn't about creating believers. Jesus was about creating followers. I want you to follow me, not believe in me. I want you to follow me, do what I do, not just believe this and go off and live like you want to. So good, new, up-to-date translations expose what's the translation behind some of Jesus. I'm going to read to you what the way Eugene Patterson translates John. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. It's about following. It's the following that matters, the embodiment. And this is the way that Peterson translates Matthew. You are the light of the world, bringing out the God colors of the world. Isn't it beautiful? God's not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this. As public as a city on the hill. If I make you light bearers, you don't think I'm going to hide you under a bucket, do you? I'm putting you on a light stand. Now that I've put you on a hilltop, on a light stand, shine. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God. You are the light of the world. So where did we begin today? They forget so quickly. Huh? Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, let me sow harmony. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Because you are the light of the world. Hope you have a good Easter. I'll see you here in 2 weeks. Thank you. Okay.